As you're being seated there, if you are new here, we are glad that you are here. We are in the middle of a series entitled Renewed, Learning to Live Life God's Way. And if you were not here and you didn't hear those first couple of messages, I want to encourage you to go online and download those. You can find those in the Cottonwood app or on cottonwoodcreek.org. Either way, whichever is best for you. And so the passage that we have been looking at is 2 Corinthians chapter 5 in verse 17. We'll put it up on the screen for you. And it says, "Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come and the old has gone away. Behold, the new is here." And as we think through that passage right there over the last couple of weeks, the first week we looked at a new life. What does it mean to have a new life in Christ? And we looked at that 2 weeks ago. And then last week we talked about having a new path for our life and a new way for our life, and talk about coming back to God. There are times in our lives that we drift from God, that we choose our own way and our own path and our own sin and our own way of doing things instead of God's way. And so last week we talked about, how do I come back to God if I've drifted away from God? This week I want to talk to you about the idea, if something is new, we need new strength. And certainly that involves a number of things. But today, because of some of the messages that are coming, I want to talk about new strength emotionally. Really, how do we gain new strength? But look at Mark chapter 12, verse 29 and 30. We're going to put it up on the screen for you. And here's what Jesus said. This is Jesus talking. And they had asked him, if you want to know the context, what are the greatest commandments and what should we learn to live? And notice what he says. He says, the most important one is this, Jesus said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." Then he says in verse 30, "You ought to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your mind, and with all of your strength." Now, as we navigate through those, that tells us a couple of things. We need to learn to love God passionately, but look at this, with all your heart. That's our emotions. We should have a passion for God. With all of our soul, that's spiritually, we should learn to love God. With all of our mind, mentally, we should constantly be transformed with the renewing of our mind. We're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. But then we should also learn to serve God with all of our strength. In other words, what are you doing physically for God to serve Him and to love Him and demonstrate your love for Him? Now, as we back up to that first idea that Jesus says we ought to learn to love God with a passion, with an emotion. Now, I realize in here that everybody is in a different space in their lives. We have some people in here that you are just passionate people. You are emotional people. And on the other end of that spectrum are engineers. Right? How many of you know what I'm talking about? They just live life by the numbers. And the truth is, you can be an engineer, or you can be an emotionally passionate person, and you can love God equally. You can love Him the same way. But the truth is, if we have been hurt in our passion or harmed in our emotions, we struggle with it. As a pastor, over the number of years here at Cottonwood, here's what I've come to the conclusion. Almost everyone in the room has a deep emotional wound. Almost everyone in the room has some sort of deep emotional wound from something that happened either way back in your childhood or in your teen years or in your early 20s or in your college days or your space. And sometimes those wounds are just still there. And here's another thing I've learned. A lot of times our emotional wounds take a lot longer to heal than physical ones do. You know, if I go out and if I cut my finger today, they may, let's don't say today on that, but if I heard they sew it up, they stitch it up, they clean it up, and guess what? In a couple of days, they'll take the stitches out and it'll begin to heal. It'll be sensitive for a while, but eventually, if it's not that bad, it'll heal. But our emotional wounds are not that way. That they can linger for a long season and a long while. But the truth is, our emotions are good for us. And I want you to know this. God gave us emotions. We're going to talk about that. Our emotions, the positive are a gift from God. If you look at that on your app or you look at that on the insert that you grabbed on your way in, our emotions are positive. They're a gift from God. Look at what it says in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. It says, so God created mankind in his own image. So God created us in his image. In other words, God took his traits and placed them in us. He says, the image of God, he created them. How did he create them? Both male and female, he created them. And then notice what it says, and God blessed them. Now, I could spend a lot of time talking about the difference between the emotion of a female and a male, but that's more like a marriage conference. That's not where I'm going today. And I could spend a whole month of Sundays just talking about how God created male and female differently and how he blessed both of us just the way we are, whether we're male or whether we're female. We're all created in the image of God. But our emotions positively, they're a gift from God. However, we don't always use our emotions or manage our emotions the way God would have us manage them. And instead of us controlling our emotions, we let our emotions control us. And that is not how God designed us. Now, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all of your strength. That's the whole person. But as we take and navigate this one portion out, I want you to know that your emotions are a gift from God. My emotions are a gift from God. He gave them to us. Now, we also want to be careful that we don't end up in one of two massive extremes. We don't want to end up way over into living a life of pure emotionalism, where I just do things based on how I feel each and every day. If I'm up, I'm going to act that way. If I'm down, I'm going to act that way. That's just emotionalism. We don't want to live there. Nor do we want to go completely to the opposite side and live life as a stoic, where I'm totally dispassionate and totally not emotional about anything that goes on in my life. In fact, if you do that, you cannot fulfill Mark chapter 12, verse 29 and 30. You can't love God with all of your heart and all of your soul and all of your might and all of your strength. You can't do that if you separate the passion and the emotions of how God created you. We've got to put it all together. Now, that doesn't mean that some aren't going to be a little more emotional than others and some are a little less emotional than others. But what we can't do is we can't only live in an emotional state, nor can we only live in a dispassionate state, because if we don't, then we are never going to become who God wants us to be. And so as we think about that, it says God created us male and female. He created them, and God blessed them. That's the positive. Your emotions were given to you by God for a reason and for a purpose. And part of being human means we're emotional. Part of the reason why we enjoy life is because God gave us emotions. God didn't create us like Siri, where we have these pre-programmed responses to life's events or life's conversations or life activities or life's victories and life's defeats. God didn't pre-program us that way. God gave us emotions and a heart and a mind and a spirit and strength so that we can respond the way God wants us to respond. So then there's the negative. That's the positive. Our emotions are given to us by God. As a matter of fact, if you read God's Word, there is right in the heart of the Bible, there is a whole section of books called the Poetical Literature. I mean, it's the Psalms and it's the Proverbs, and you can see Job in there, and you can see Song of Solomon and Ecclesiastes. Man, there is a lot of passion in those books, but particularly the Psalms. David was great at expressing what he was feeling at the day in a particular psalm. There were times that David would say, man, I am completely discouraged, and he writes a psalm for us. There are other times that David would say, I am so angry, and he writes a psalm. Then there are times that David says, man, I am just excited about life, and he writes a psalm. And so as you read through the Psalms, you'll notice that there are some psalms that are written in an amazing passion of victory, others in an amazing state of defeat. And so our emotions are positive, but they can also be negative. Let me just give you a couple of biblical examples of people who let their emotions control them, and they didn't control their emotions in different seasons. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 17, this is Solomon. And let me tell you where Solomon is. He's moving towards the end of his life, and he's lost sight of God's purpose in his life. And there might be some folks here today that you have lost sight of why God created you because of what's gone on in your life, or some of the decisions you've made, or those around you have made. You might be in a state, in a place where Solomon is in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 17. You've lost purpose. And so notice what happens when we lose our purpose and we begin to let our emotions control us instead of us controlling our emotions. Notice what Solomon says in verse 17. He says, so I hated life because the work that is done, all the work that is done under the sun was grievous to me. In other words, I lost my purpose. Then notice he says, all is meaningless. This is worthless. This isn't worth anything. He goes, it's just a chasing after the wind. If you and I lose our purpose, if we lose our purpose, we are going to consistently be dispassionate about life. It's going to be like chasing after the wind. Guess what? You will never catch it. What about the prophet Elijah? Right after him, prophet Elijah, if you go read the story in 1 Corinthians chapter 18, the prophet Elijah has his greatest victory in all of his life. There on Mount Carmel, he does battle against the prophets of Baal, and he sees God bless him, and he's just had a great victory. One chapter over, just a few verses in, he has gone from the highest high to the lowest low. And look at 1 Kings chapter 19, verse 4. We'll put it up on the screen. And this is what happens when we find ourselves emotionally alone or isolated by ourselves. Here's what Elijah says. He says, while he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness. What does that mean? That he withdrew from people physically and emotionally and spiritually. He got away from people. And one of the things that I see constantly happen in people's lives is when they go through a struggle in their life, oftentimes their response is to withdraw. But over 50 times throughout God's Word, it says one another, one another, one another, one another. In other words, God created us as relational beings. He didn't create us to live a life of isolation. And so now you have Elijah, a prophet of God who loves God, who has done great victory and great things in their life. And notice what it says. It says, while he went on a long journey into the wilderness, he came to a broom bush, and he sat down under it, and listen to this, prayed to God that he would just die. And notice what he says. He says, I have had enough, Lord. He says, Lord, please take my life. Boy, that is a guy that has drifted away and isolated himself, not only from relationships, from people, from his purpose in life, but also he's done it not just physically, but emotionally as well. And if we aren't careful, we can do that very same thing. I don't know if you saw the news this week, but there was a pastor of a very large church in California that had been open about his struggles with depression and some of the struggles that he went through. And this week he took his life. In a moment of feeling exactly what Elijah felt, he took his life. Left his wife and his young kids, all because in a moment of isolation, in a moment of despair, he was away and he was just like Elijah was. Lord, take my life. You say, Pastor, what is your thought on that? He made a tragic decision, a sinful decision, to kill himself. And left many grieving. You've got a grieving congregation. You've got a grieving bride. You've got grieving children. For those who have been around here for a long time, you know that my brother took his life. He had battled addiction and struggles and different things. And in a moment, and in a season, in a time, he felt just like Elijah. And he took his own life. And it was a sinful decision. He really killed himself. It was homicide against yourself. That is not right. Folks, if we aren't careful, we can drift in such a space and way. And there are many in this room that, hey, there are times that we were up and there are times we were down, but we don't get that. You know, that's not where we go when we're down, that I'm just ready to die. But if it can happen to Elijah, it can happen to you. And if it can happen to Elijah, it can happen to spiritual giants and people who love God. So look at Jonah. Remember Jonah, there are times that as Solomon found out, that we oftentimes get extremely emotional and depressed when we lose our purpose, as Elijah found when we isolate ourselves physically or emotionally. But look at Jonah, when we don't get our way, or when we're physically exhausted, we've come to the end of our road. If you look in Jonah chapter 4, verse 8, if you remember the story, Jonah was called to go to Nineveh. He didn't want to go to Nineveh. Why didn't he want to go to Nineveh? Because he didn't like Ninevites. And he knew, hey, if I go preach the gospel to the Ninevites, although they're an unrighteous people, an ungodly people, Jonah knew that God was so loving that he was going to forgive them and save them. And so Jonah didn't want to go. And finally said, all right, God said, you're going to go. So Jonah goes. He preaches the gospel. Sure enough, a great revival happens. And Jonah didn't get his way. Jonah is exhausted. If you look at Jonah chapter 4, verse 8, it says, when the sun rose, God provided a scorching east wind, and the sun blazed on Jonah's head so that he grew faint, and he wanted to die. And he said, it would be better for me to die than to live. Boy, Jonah was asked by God to do something he didn't want to do. Sure enough, Jonah does obediently follow God, and God does an incredible thing in the lives of those in the land that he preached. And then Jonah gets exhausted. God causes a tree to grow up for him to give him shade, and then God allows the tree to go away. And when he does that, Jonah says, man, I am growing faint and I want to die. It would be better had I never been born. I want you to know that is always a wrong answer. It is always better, regardless of how you feel right now, that you were born, that you are who God created you to be, and we want to be who God creates us to be. So we see Solomon lost his purpose. We see Elijah distanced himself from people and isolated himself from people and got depressed. We see right here, Jonah didn't get his way. What about Paul? Well, we think the spiritual giant, the Apostle Paul, he went through some difficult circumstances in life. And so maybe that's where you are right now, because maybe your marriage or your relationships or your vocation or your finances, they're a wreck, they're a mess, and the pressures have built up and the expectations are beyond your control. And maybe you feel like Paul did. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 8. He says, we do not want you to be uninformed. He says, I'm going to be honest with you. I'm going to share it with you. I'm going to tell you, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced. What is he saying? Man, things didn't go my way. I've been struggling. All I've done is the right thing after the right thing after the right thing, and it seems like the only thing that happens to me emotionally and physically and spiritually is I get dirt kicked in my face. And he says, we're under great pressure. He says, I'm under great pressure. He says, far beyond our ability to endure it, so that we despaired even of life itself. And maybe you're in that space right now. That, boy, you've got money pressures beyond what others can imagine. Maybe you have relational pressures or marriage pressures beyond what others can even imagine. Maybe you have pressures as a parent or as a student or as a teen or as a child that others can even imagine. Whatever the pressures are, man, there are others who have been through that same space and that same place, and they felt the same thing. But what do Solomon, Jonah, Elijah, and Paul all have in common? If you want to know what they had in common, although they despaired of life, they didn't end their life. And you can track each of their stories, and they see God's grace again They get back in relationship with other people. They refine their purpose. They reshape their lives, and they see their future ultimately fulfilled. So if you're in one of those dips, those seasons of darkness, those seasons of doubt, those seasons of struggles right now, all I can encourage you with is keep going, because each of the four people that I just shared with you, spiritual giants of the faith, who got to a space in their life they just hated life because they continued to serve God and just learned to love God with all their heart and with all their soul and with all their mind and with all their strength, they saw God's blessings again. So let me give you a couple of quick thoughts today, and we're going to move over to the Lord's Supper here in a few minutes. Let me give you a couple of thoughts today on why I need to control my emotions, why I need to control my emotions. Here's thought number one. You ready? Thought number one is my emotions are untrustworthy. I can never trust my emotions. They are unreliable. They're not dependable at all. Usually my emotions are not good judges of fact and fiction. They just aren't. My emotions are untrustworthy. As we look at Proverbs chapter 14, verse 12. He says, there is a way that appears right, but in the end it leads to death. My emotions are untrustworthy. They're unreliable. They don't do a good job of telling the truth about what's really going on in life. Let me tell you, if you want to write this down, write this down. Here's something that your emotions are really good at. Your emotions and my emotions are really good at making mountains out of molehills. They are experts. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Man, something little happens in my life and I walk away from a conversation and then I begin to rethink about that conversation or what took place, and all of a sudden a direct word or even a word of discipline becomes a word of intense hatred, and they don't like me. And not only do they not like me, not anybody I'm around likes me. And not only do anybody I know, even people who don't know me don't like me. Your emotions and our emotions are experts at making mountains out of molehills. And we've got to control our emotions. Why? Because they're untrustworthy. We'll walk around, and let me tell you what, nothing will sap your energy more. Physically, spiritually, and emotionally, nothing will sap your energy more than climbing mountains all your life. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Man, I would much prefer to go downhill or at least walk on a flat surface than always climbing an emotional mountain. For lack of discipline, they will die led astray by their own great folly, is what it says next. So here, let me give you a next thought. My emotions will keep me from being successful in life. My emotions will keep me from being successful in my life. And that's a truth. If we live our life in a state of constant emotionalism, they will lampoon our careers, they will lampoon our relationships, they will lampoon our friendships, they will destroy my finances because I'll make emotional purchases, I'll make emotional statements at the office, and guess what? I'll be pushed aside. And if you follow your emotions too much, they will absolutely make you unsuccessful in life. Proverbs chapter 5, verse 23 says, for lack of discipline, that's talking about holding on to our emotions, they will die. They will be led astray by their own great folly. They will be led astray. There are more and more studies over the last really 7 to 10 years that have been, as they study those who are successful in life and those who do well in life, and they're finding out that yes, your IQ is important to your success, but perhaps your EQ is more important than your success. In other words, more deals are done out on the playground than in a classroom, right? And you say your IQ, we all know what the IQ is. Our EQ is an emotional quotient. In other words, are we smart enough to read a situation emotionally, but then when we walk away from a situation, live in a space and in a right place where I handle my emotions well, where I don't let my emotions run away with me? Because let me tell you what, if you walk through the office and all of a sudden your boss gives you a harsh word and you respond emotionally, guess what? They know where the door is, right? And if we live our lives as emotional wrecks, man, we are going to find ourselves undisciplined in what we say and what we do and how we live. Man, if you an emotional purchase, we're going to go home. Many of us are going to watch the Cowboys game, and that's the way God designed it. We're going to sit there and watch the game. And here's what I know: by the end of the game, I'm going to want emotionally a new car, to drink a different beer. I don't drink beer, but I'm going to after today, right? There are going to be things that I'm like, I didn't know I wanted that, but as I look there, I need that apparently. Look at how happy they are. I've noticed that. No one sells anything that's going to destroy my life. And if I'm feeling a little down because the Cowboys are down perhaps, then what am I going to do? I'm going to want to say, man, I can't live my life emotionally. It'll destroy my marriage, my relationship with my kids, my relationship at the office. It'll destroy a lot of things. I will tell you what, as a pastor, you don't want me every week to be here one week and then there the next and here and there. You want me to be able to control my emotions. Why? Because that's how God can use me. Here's a third thought why you need to control your emotions. If I'm not careful, my emotions will manipulate me. My emotions will manipulate me. Boy, if I don't control my emotions will control me. Notice what Proverbs chapter 25, verse 28 says. It says, like a city whose walls are broken through is a person who lacks self-control. Boy, here's what I've found in my life. If I lose control of my emotions, or perhaps if I lose control of my temper, usually my tongue will get me in trouble. How many of you know what I'm talking about? There's the issue, then there becomes the issue. Right? Why? My emotions have manipulated me. I've thought about, boy, if they say this to me and if this happens again or they're doing this to me, they'll manipulate me. They'll manipulate me. Here's the next thought. My emotions, why we had to control our emotions, my emotions will make me an easy target for Satan. That's exactly what we saw with all those people, those spiritual giants, Solomon and Elijah and Paul and Jonah. We saw that over and over, that their emotions made them easy prey for Satan. Look at 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8. It says, be alert. That's mentally, by the way. Be alert and be sober-minded. That's sober-minded, it means emotionally. That's talking about the emotions. The first one is talking about mental. The second one is talking about emotions. Why? Because your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour, to eat. Literally, if I let my emotions control my life, Satan will eat me alive. He will destroy me. That's exactly what we saw with the 4 illustrations that I gave you early. And we have to understand that I have to control and I have to manage my emotions. All right, so if there's good biblical reasons for me to manage my emotions, how do I manage my unwanted feelings? There are times, and I will tell you, there are times in every one of our lives, and maybe you're in one of those spaces, that you feel something, your emotions are telling you something that are not true, and you can't get over them. So let me give you a couple of thoughts. Number one, you have to guard your heart. We have to learn to guard our heart. We have to watch what we put into our mind and what we focus on and what we see and what we do. And study after study right now we're looking at, particularly with our teens, is that the more they look and the more they look at social media and the more they look at their phone or the more they look at the computer screen, typically their state of despair goes down further and further and further. Why? Because they're constantly comparing. Everybody has or is having a better day than I am. Why? Because those are the ones that are posting. And we take that as truth, and a lot of times they're lying. Here's what I know. If you or I follow 300 people on a given day, chances are 200 of them are having more fun than I am right now. How many of you know that? Right? And they're going to post it, and they're going to talk about it, and they're going to say, oh my goodness. And you know, I follow some pastors, and And it's just amazing to me. And some of the larger pastors, where all they go and what all they do. And I'm sitting there going, that is great. And I looked at Gina and I said, hey, Gina, just this summer, I took you to Mexico, Miami, and Orlando. How many of y'all think that's a pretty good summer, right? Here's what you don't know. Miami and Orlando are in Oklahoma. But it sure sounds good, right? And they call it Miami, Oklahoma, by the way. That's a student camp. I took her to student camp with me when I was preaching. And then a couple of weeks later, we had to go to Orlando, which is just outside of Stillwater, for a wedding. We made a long drive up there on a Saturday night, a long drive back. And I said, baby, you're a big-time pastor's wife. Mexico, Miami, and Orlando, one summer. We can look around, we can compare ourselves. Look at Proverbs. I love what it says in Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23. It says, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart. What goes in our heart is ultimately going to come out of our heart. This morning, probably like many of you here, we got up. What did I do? If you're taking a shower, you reach down, grab the shampoo bottle, you squeeze it. What comes out? Shampoo, hopefully. And hopefully, in my case, it's not the dog shampoo, right? Then you go over and you're going to brush your teeth. And what do? You grab the toothpaste and you squeeze the toothpaste. And what comes out? Toothpaste, hopefully. And when we are squeezed, whatever's in our heart will be what comes out. So we've got to guard our heart. Here's number 2, control your temper and your tongue. How do I manage? You've got to control your temper and your tongue. I have to manage my anger and my temper and not let it manage me. I can't do it. Look at James chapter 1, verse 19 and 20. It says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry. Why? Because human anger does not produce the fruit of righteousness that God desires in us. But we have to be slow to anger. We have to control our temper. I can't walk around life constantly blowing up. Look at another one. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 3 says, those who guard their lips preserve their lives, but those who speak rashly will ultimately come to ruin. Man, when I lose my temper, my tongue will get me into more trouble. A lot of times what happens is we have to deal with the aftermath, not of what happened, but of what we said, right? And once we've said it, we can't unsay it one time. Look at Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11. It says, fools and only fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise ultimately bring calm in the end. Who do the wise calm? First of all, they calm themselves, then they calm those around them. When something's getting out of control, the wise person comes in and says, calm down. Let's not let this thing get bigger than it is. Let's don't make mountain out of a molehill. Here's number 3, don't be judgmental and unforgiving. The more you walk around judging other people, the more you're inside going to judge yourself. Don't judge people. Don't walk around always pointing out someone's spots, because I'll tell you, the people who walk around pointing out someone's wrong most often are always pointing their self, looking at themselves. We've got to look at what Jesus said in Luke chapter 6, verse 37. He says, do not judge others, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. He says, instead, forgive, and ultimately you will be forgiven as well. Look at Proverbs chapter 19, verse 11. It says, a person's wisdom yields patience. It is to one's glory to overlook an offense. Man, we have to learn to walk around with a forgiving spirit and a forgiving heart. Don't live in a space where you constantly don't forgive someone else. Look at number 4 real quick. Ask God to give you the fruit of the Spirit. Remember we talked about guarding your heart? Now ask God to give you the fruit of the Spirit. What are the fruit of the Spirit? Let me just talk to you about them. Galatians chapter 5, verse 22 and 23 says, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And against such things there is no law. Well, if you think about all of those have somewhere, in some way relate either directly or indirectly to our emotional responses. We got to live a life with forbearance. Man, that's not just physical, that's an emotional. With kindness, yes, that turns out physical, but it started with the emotional. And goodness, that's an emotional and mental state, a faithfulness, a gentleness, a joy, and a peace. And we think about, and then ultimately self-control. Man, ask God, and as you guard your heart, God, let me live, think, speak, talk, and act today with a spirit of faithfulness and the fruit of the Spirit. Here's number 5. I need to overcome my feelings with positive action. I need to overcome my feelings with positive action. If you're in the dumps today, if you're kind of down and out emotionally, the best thing you can do is not go isolate yourself, to not go think about everything that is wrong in your life, but to instead go do something positively. Overcome how you feel with what you do. Go do something positive. Instead of going and saying something negative, go say something positive. Instead of doing something or responding negatively, go do something positive. Man, do it with all of your strength and all of your might and all of your spirit and all of your heart. And from time to time, if you wake up on a Sunday morning and you don't feel like coming to church, but you know that's making you more and more distant from God, overcome it with a positive action. Say, I'm going to go, I'm going to go. Look at what the psalmist said in Psalm 55. It says, listen to my prayer, O God, and do not ignore my plea. Hear, listen to this, and answer me. Why? My thoughts trouble me, and I'm distraught. What is the psalmist saying? Hey, I'm distraught and I really don't know why. Then notice as he goes on, he says, why? Because my enemies are saying about me. What are they saying about me? Because the threats of the wicked they've made about me, for they bring down suffering on me and assail me with anger. He has said what? What I'm feeling is actual. There are times that our emotions make mountains out of molehills, but you always want to ask yourself the question, are my feelings proportional to the problem? Are my feelings, what I'm feeling right now, proportional to the problem? And then how am I going to respond? I love what Paul summed up everything that David said right there in Romans chapter 12, verse 21. And this is where we'll close and we'll make our journey into the Lord's Supper season. I love what Paul says. He says, do not be overcome with evil, but overcome evil with good. He says, don't struggle in a space that God didn't intend you for. But instead, overcome whatever struggle you're going through with something good. There are some other ideas that you'll notice. We went ahead and put in the answers there on the bottom of your insert, and you can listen to those this week. I will go through all of those in my daily devotions.